In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. One of the things I love about our language is how people mix up famous quotes. There are even whole websites devoted to all these misquoted quotations. You know, you hear these things that you think you know, like Gandhi's, "Be the change you want to see in the world." He didn't say that. Apparently what he really said was, if we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change, which isn't quite as catchy. On the other hand, I'm not sure how much I trust that particular website because it also listed this famous quote, "Money is the root of all evil." And indeed, that is a misquote. But what it adds is, here's what the Bible actually says. The love of money is the root of all evil. We know that's not true because we just listened to it, right? It's right there in your bulletin. It says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. That's different. Now, you can debate what kinds of evil the love of money brings about, or even what Paul meant by evil. But whether you think money is the root of evil or not, I would like to suggest that it does lead to all kinds of madness. And by madness, I mean irrational behavior. We have two compelling and very different examples of this madness in today's lessons. We start off with Jesus' sobering story of the rich man and poor Lazarus. And you know the story well, I'm pretty sure. It just shows how irrational all that money made the rich man. I mean, poor Lazarus, he's a pretty simple case, right? He is a poor, homeless man. He has no means to support himself, but we can assume, because of the way the culture worked, he was also ridiculed for being poor. One should ask, did he really want to be poor? Was that a situation he asked to be in? Usually, and certainly in those days, people were often born into it or they fell onto hard times. Nobody wants to be poor, and Lazarus did not either. But Jesus says, through all of that pain and anguish, he will be comforted. If not in this life, then in the next. The real focus of this parable isn't on Lazarus, even though he's the one who gets a name. It's on the rich man and his irrational behavior. And by irrational, I mean, listen, this is a guy who has everything he could want. That's what Jesus is trying to say. This is not somebody who's just comfortable. Not just someone who's well off. This is a guy whose cup overfloweth. So what does he do with this money? He, first of all, throws big banquets, but then he stores it all away. He hoards his money. He is so rich. And on top of that, he steps over the poor guy lying down in the street who can't feed himself. Does he lift a single finger to help that guy? No. Because it's his fault for being poor. If anything, he might complain that the guy is messing up the property values. I say this because I have heard people say, "Oh, those homeless, what an eyesore they are. How they're messing up the neighborhood." I heard this from a guy stepping out of a limousine. Sometimes we speak of them, those lying in the street, as if they were objects, as if they were trash that needed to be picked up. Not only has our rich man in the story today hoarded all of his wealth for himself, again, far more than he can possibly use, but even after he dies, He believes that the privileges of wealth still apply to him. Even when he finds himself in hell, presumably for his cruel self-centeredness, even then, he's given Abraham orders. Send Lazarus down to quench my thirst. That is madness. And that's what Abraham tells him. Abraham says, hey, listen, you don't seem to grasp the situation here. The situation here is that you had your good stuff and you didn't do anything good with it. And now Lazarus gets it. You do not control the world. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus talks a lot about wealth. We know this. There's another story he tells about another rich man, and he doesn't go quite into so much detail, but he does say this. The man gets rich, and then he gets richer, and then he gets richer, and he says to himself, hey, I'm really rich. What'll I do with all this money? I know what I'll do with it. I'll build bigger barns so I can store more of my wealth. And then God comes to him and says, sorry, you're going to die tonight, and none of that stuff is any good to you. That's madness, where you have all this and you just lock it away for yourself, where it helps nobody and harms a lot of people. We see this today. You've certainly read about the multi-billionaires who have hundreds of times more than they could ever possibly use in a lifetime, yet they keep collecting more and more money, and then they store it in offshore accounts so they don't have to pay taxes on it. What kind of crazy is that? What kind of greediness is that? That is madness. And if you want an example a little closer to home, we can actually look in our own buildings. I don't know if you know the story of how we got our rectory and how we got the parish house. There was a woman named Sylvia Wilkes, and her husband was buried here for, we don't quite know what reason, but he had relatives here, so he was buried here. And after a few years, she called up the rector and said, tell me what condition the mausoleum, my husband's mausoleum is in, and whatever it takes to fix it up, no questions asked, I'll give it to you. And he went around, looked around, called her back up and said, we don't need anything, thanks, it's fine. She was impressed with the honesty, and when she died, left us $1 million, which built the parish house and the rectory. Great stuff, right? What you may not have known is that her mother was a woman named Hetty Green, who was once the richest woman in the world. And yet Hetty Green was so tight with her money that not only did she not help anybody else, she didn't help her own. She did not keep a permanent address because she would then have to pay taxes. She was so tight and so mean that when her own son injured his leg, she refused to take him to the doctor because she didn't want to pay the doctor bills. And when the leg became gangrenous, she finally relented and went to the free clinic, where they then had to amputate his leg. The richest woman in the world. That is madness. She was so focused on keeping her money for herself, which she never used, that it was no earthly good. That kind of greed is sheer madness. That's the kind of evil Paul was talking about. The gifts we receive from God come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And some of us are blessed with greater wealth than others. That's not a big deal. Some of us are born into wealth through no fault of our own. the question that Jesus always asks is, what is that wealth to you? Do you see it as a wall that separates you from the other children of God? Or a bridge that connects you to the others, especially those who are the most vulnerable of God's children? Nothing evil about the money itself. But it can lead you away from God or toward God. Now, there's another kind of money madness, if you will. Because there's not just the evil madness to cling to money, to hoard money. There's another kind of madness. At least, it's madness in the eyes of the world. And we have a Bible story for that too, of course. It's the kind of madness that the world says, what are you doing with your money? You don't have enough to feed yourself. How can you care for somebody else? It's the kind of madness of the woman who takes in ironing for years and years and eats very simply and lives very simply, all the while saving up more than $1 million to send other kids to college who can't afford to go. And yeah, that's a real story. It's a young man who works all night at McDonald's. And you know how well they pay. And then donates his time and his money at the homeless shelter. Or maybe it's the kind of madness that Jeremiah shows in today's Old Testament reading. There was not actually a whole lot of money in the prophet business. So Jeremiah wasn't really that rich. And he finds himself in a very awkward situation because the country is just about to be overrun, taken over, occupied, and he knows this. He's a prophet after all, right? But everybody pretty much knows Israel is doomed. They're going to come in, they're going to take them off into exile. So what does Jeremiah do in this impending doom? He goes out and buys some land. Ask any real estate agent, and they would tell you that was probably not a good investment. He's never going to see that land. He's never going to see that money again. It might have been a whole lot wiser if he had stored some of that money, brought it with him, and he could have used it in exile. But instead, he buys this land. That's madness, right? Why did he do it? He did it as a sign from God, an encouragement to the people of God. It was a sign that says, you have not been abandoned by God. It's a sign that says, you will come home again someday, and that is my pledge, that you will not be in exile forever. You will not be homeless forever. It seems like madness to people who are trying to just scramble for everything they can so that they can be more comfortable. But Jeremiah says, there's something more important than that going on here. It is more important to give hope to the people of God. It seems like madness, the way he just sort of threw away his money. But to the world, giving hope and giving encouragement can seem like madness. When gathering as much as you can and having as much as you can, sort of like a dragon's lair. You know how dragons, they just have all this gold and then they just sleep on it. If that's your goal, then yeah, giving hope to other people seems like madness. But which is more irrational? Using your wealth for the betterment of others, or locking it away? Actually, everybody has to answer that question for themselves, but I can say this much about that. We are followers of Jesus Christ. We know what Jesus asks us to do. We know how Jesus asks us to care for each other. And even Paul, who I don't always get along with all that well, Paul knows the answer, and he articulates it pretty well in today's letter to Timothy. He says, we are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for ourselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that we may take hold of the life that really is life. Amen.